This is what people from Canada and the US picture when they think of Europe, because this is where we go on vacation. Historic buildings, pedestrian streets, plazas, I love it. And this is a real residential neighborhood, not even the touristy oldest parts of the city. Lots of people do live here, but a lot of Europeans don't live here. They actually live in the suburbs. And that's why I came here to a suburb of Lyon, France, to see what's similar and what's different to suburbs back home. I want to look at the density, the pedestrian infrastructure. How good is the transit? This is Mézières, a suburb of almost 40,000 people east of Lyon. The French word for suburb, banlieue, often has the connotation of social housing projects in France. This is not that. This is a mostly post-World War II neighborhood with a ton of standalone houses. Many apartments too, mainly near the town center. This is a place where you see signs for monster trucks, lawn care, and buying used cars. This is very recognizably suburban from my perspective here in Canada, and I think for those in Australia, New Zealand, and the US too. But there are also some interesting and surprising differences that I want to cover in this video. The single most dramatic difference with suburbs back home is scale. Not the houses or lots, those were actually comparable, roughly. Here's Mézières on the left versus, let's say, Calgary on the right. Not that different. Where Mézières is built at a fundamentally different scale is the roads. The residential streets were a little smaller, but the main roads were much smaller. When I was walking around here, I didn't see even one non-highway road that had more than one travel lane in each direction. There were turning lanes at many intersections, but I didn't see any of the 4, 6, 8-lane monster arterials that you'd encounter in the suburbs of similarly sized Anglosphere cities. Here's the biggest intersection I could find in Mézières, near a large shopping center, bottom left. And here's a random intersection in Calgary, near a large shopping center, top left. France. Canada. France. Canada. This is wild to me. Compare the pedestrian experience here
We keep on moving. We keep on moving.
with the experience here.
What can you say when love goes away?
How can two places with similar metro area populations have such different roads? The French suburb probably has more trips handled without a car, although most households, 90%, still own cars here. They are less likely to own multiple cars than suburban households in Canada, Australia, or the US. But this is not central Lyon, where cars are a solid minority of trips. Also important, roundabouts and turning lanes boost road capacity a lot, even with fewer travel lanes. Finally, I also wonder if France just has different road design standards that aren't as obsessed with minimizing congestion in the worst hour or two of the day, which leads to overbuilt roads operating well below capacity the rest of the time. Parking is another area where the scale is different versus suburbs where I'm from. Right when I got off the tram, I saw a new high school, lycée, with 0 student parking. How common is that in suburban high schools where you're from? They're assuming most of the students will be able to arrive by foot, bike, or transit. To be clear, most places here do have some parking, but it's not as extravagant. Even this hypermarket with a legitimately big parking lot pales in comparison to this shopping center in suburban Calgary. These shots are at the same scale. For transit, the 2 tram stops in residential Mézières have little parking, just 100 spots total. But the 2 stops at the end of the line have more, about 1,000 spots total. 1,000 spots is fairly big for a tram or LRT, but it's not enormous by the standard of stations in Denver and Calgary. Street parking, not as universal as suburbs back home. Some residential streets had just 1 lane, some had none. It's harder to park on the street and use your garage for storage here. I wondered if the lower parking availability would result in improper parking practices, like I sometimes see in European cities and Philadelphia. For the most part, no. I saw a few cars parked on pedestrian pathways or sidewalks, but it wasn't too common. The eastern 1/3 of Mézières is an industrial area, and even this feels relatively compact compared to industrial areas in, say, Calgary or Denver. After scale, the second most striking difference about this suburb was all the walls. Almost all houses are walled off with a high fence, gate, wall, or hedge. Enough, in most cases, that you couldn't talk to someone through it and see their face. This is really common in France and some other European countries. It's a very big difference from suburbs I'm familiar with on this side of the Atlantic. Where I'm from, backyard fences are common, but front barriers are pretty rare. If there's anything, it's usually a low fence like this. When you think about it, this actually takes the idea of suburbia to more of an extreme. It's a boost to privacy and personal space, at the cost of feeling hostile and walled off to outsiders. I actually felt kinda weird walking through, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I don't know if it's connected, but it made me think of how central Lyon, like many other European cities I've visited, spams bollards everywhere. These don't feel hostile like the suburban walls, but I wondered if they're connected by an underlying desire to delineate space. If you're thinking the walls are just a result of smaller European lots needing extra privacy measures, that doesn't actually explain it. These 10 houses in Messieurs and these 9 houses in the suburbs of my city have about the same lot size. But the French suburb has walls, and the Quebec suburb is open to the street. Those were the two things that made this French suburb feel most different. The more human scale of the public realm and the walls around the private realm. Here's a little more context on transportation in the suburb. Transit to the city center from Messieurs is pretty good. It's connected to Lyon by T3, a fast suburban tram line largely separated from traffic. You can get to the business district in a half hour or connect to the metro a bit earlier. Going to other suburbs, like if you work in this industrial area, is usually not competitive. Most people here commute by car, although transit holds its own. About 20% of people in Messieurs take transit to work, which is noticeably higher than the numbers for similarly situated suburbs in similarly sized cities in the Anglosphere. Similarly situated suburbs in similarly sized cities. The bike infrastructure here is better than Canadian suburbs, but not dramatically so. I saw some pretty respectable protected bike lanes and multi-use pathways, but they didn't cover the city as extensively as you'd find in the bicycle paradise that is Dutch suburbia. The pedestrian experience in Messieurs was better than back home by virtue of the fact that I never had to cross, or even walk along, a gigantic suburban arterial. There are also small stores and restaurants mixed into the residential areas. Not nearly as many as in central Lyon, but better than a typical Anglosphere suburb. However, the pedestrian infrastructure was arguably worse than the Canadian suburbs I know. How are you supposed to handle this with a wheelchair? I found many of the sidewalks in Messieurs to be narrow, overgrown, blocked, or lacking in curb cuts. Those are the little ramps from sidewalk to road level. This suburb has pretty easy highway access, but it goes around the edge of town, not through it. And the highway also doesn't go directly through the city center, like in a lot of other cities. Just a final point on the houses in Messieurs. They were generally comparable in size to the earlier, more modest suburban houses and bungalows in North American suburbs that I know. And they were built at a similar time, the few decades after World War II. But the beefier houses we're getting now in more recent suburban developments, I didn't see anything like those in this French suburb. Also, I've picked a lot on Calgary in this video, because it has a similar metro area population to Lyon, because it also has a train, and because in the past I've used it as an example of surprisingly compact suburbia. That remains true for residential density, but the streets, parking, and commercial areas are very much supersized. People from Lyon are probably wondering, why in the world did you visit there? Don't worry, I didn't just visit there. But I am really interested in European suburbs. I live in a suburban country. A lot of people here like having a house and a yard and a garage. Not everyone, but a lot. I'm interested in how suburbs can provide these things, but also be made more livable. A few years ago, we visited suburbs in the Netherlands that had top-notch cycling. They were a great example of how bikes are actually really practical in a suburban context. In this French suburb, there were a lot of things I found interesting, from the tram to the walls. But my biggest takeaway is scale. The houses and lots in Maizieu were not dramatically different from back home. Most households own cars. They have hypermarkets and industrial employment areas. This is not the picturesque urbanist paradise of a historic city center, but the roads, parking lots, intersections, space between things, all built at a fundamentally different scale. Paying attention to suburbs in other places, you have to wonder how much of what we build is actually necessary for suburbia, versus how much we just decided to build and never really questioned.